What's going on, Jecorey? I want to thank you for joining me on today's show. I'm glad to have you back on the channel. It's been a while. I think it was about maybe was it a year ago? I think last time I had you on. I'm not quite sure. If not a year ago, it was very close to a year ago.
I'm glad to be back and talking politics. We got to keep these conversations going all year round.
Before we get too deep into our conversation, though, let the people know just a little bit about who you are and what you do. Who is Jecorey?
Peace. I'm Jecorey Arthur, born, raised, proudly still living in the west end of Louisville, Kentucky, home of Muhammad Ali, also home of Breonna Taylor, former home of Breonna Taylor, and a home of Jim Crow, who was a slave who eventually was mimicked and mocked around the country and created this minstrelsy. And then, of course, the Jim Crow laws that became known after that fact. I'm a Louisville City Councilman representing the 4th District, so downtown Louisville and then parts of the surrounding neighborhoods. I'm also a professor at our local historically Black college, Simmons College of Kentucky, the first college in this state for Black Kentuckians. And I'm a musician who makes hip hop and classical music. I play with our local orchestra. I play with the Dallas Symphony next weekend. I play with orchestras all around the world. And that's who I am in a nutshell.
For sure. Now, I want to really dive into local politics with you being in city council, right? Um, a lot of people tend to be very fixated on the national stage when it comes to politics. They're fixated on, Trump versus Biden or Ron DeSantis versus Biden or the back and forths between, AOC versus Marjorie Taylor Greene. But when it comes to local politics, that goes largely ignored. And it's the response from people when you bring it up, or at least what I've noticed, is that it's almost as if it's pretty cliche. It's just a default thing to say, oh, well, you should pay attention to local politics, local politics. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there's such a large fixation that we all have on the national stage, but when it comes to local politics, our own backyard, we largely ignore it?
Well, I think you could almost relate that to other fields. So I said I'm a musician, and I think here locally, the current trend is like everybody's trying to get Beyonce tickets. Everybody's trying to get Beyonce tickets when she comes to perform here in Louisville, but you might not know who the local R&B singers are who are putting in a lot of work trying to get known. You might not care. I think to a certain extent, the national figures have this level of popularity, and that's good and bad, that puts them in a position where folks are more interested in what's going on with them. But the decision that the president makes today might not impact you for however long. The decision that your local mayor makes today could impact you tomorrow. So it's real important to understand and get engaged with local politics just because it's closer to the people. You're going to go to the grocery store and you might run into your mayor, you might run into a city council person or a city commissioner or an alderman. You're probably not running into President Joe Biden. You're probably not running into Representative, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You're probably not running into these national figures that you have a lot of chatter about online. National politics is a much bigger stage and a lot more complex. Local politics is closer to home, it's closer to the people. And in my opinion, a lot easier for you to impact that change. Our local city council, you can pass anything legal with 14 votes, and that's 14 out of 26 council members. You want to pass something through the House of Representatives in Congress? Well, 218. So getting that 218 votes for people across the country is a lot harder than getting 14 votes for people who live right in your city.
How important is city council? Like, there's a lot of positions to run for, within, local elections and local politics when you're looking at that. But I want to go back to the fact that, like I said, what I've noticed is what I said earlier, is that I've noticed is that a lot of people kind of tend to look at local politics as being cliche when you just kind of bring it up in general political discussions that are happening nationally, right? And one of the things that a lot of people, when they do bring up local politics, what seems to be by default is you should run for your local city council. How important is city council in the greater body of local politics?
So the city council in Louisville and really largely across the country is making decisions every single week about your life, really every day about your life at the local level. So your community center, whether or not that's open, what hours they have, how much the staff is getting paid, what programs go into that community center are decided upon and can be enforced and mandated by your city council. Your libraries, again, decisions being made and ordinances and laws being passed by your city council. Your police department, and that should, be straightforward for folks to really understand. These police officers that are terrorizing the Black community, you can change the way they police through your city council. So all of these local departments, these local agencies, your city council can make or break that because they're helping govern that local government. Example, our city council, we're reopening community centers in our council district with some of the federal money that came down. We're reopening a library in our council district because of some of the federal money that went down, renovating things and making sure that the services you get are the best that they can be. But those decisions are being made by your city council. They're not being made by Congress. They're not being made by the state. The state and Congress might have more money and they might have more political power as far as the geographics of where those laws are and where they touch. But again, if you can't get 14 votes on your local city council, how are you going to get 218 votes for the House of Representatives in Congress?
Now, one of the things that I've been stressing a lot on this channel, because I've been putting a large emphasis on local politics and wanting people to get more involved in that. And I've been stressing and stating a lot that I feel that we can do more through local politics than we can do through national politics when it comes to repairing the Black community. How realistic is that thought when I'm saying that we can do more in terms of repairing the Black community through local politics than we can through what essentially has become the circus of national politics?
So you're right. I don't want to say you're wrong because you're not wrong. You're right. But also, I'm going to push back as well. So going back to the whole 14 votes here locally in Louisville, Kentucky versus 218 votes in Washington, D.C. with Congress, you can transform that Black community. There's an easier path locally by getting that smaller amount of votes. And again, these are people you can pull up on. You can go and see at your local city hall, wherever your city council meets, not necessarily going to Washington, D.C., going to go, lobby Congress. So you're right in the sense that absolutely you're going to be able to transform that community on a much easier path. But when I think about the resources that exist at the federal level, you can't really compare. So we talk about reparations, local versus federal. Well, the professor from UConn, Thomas Kramer, who I like to get an estimate from, is talking about $20.9 trillion. When you break that number down here locally in Louisville, we're talking about 70 to 80 billion dollars per descendant. Not per descendant, but for the descendants collectively right here in my city. Our city budget is $1.3 billion. So as far as transforming the Black community, we're really a Band-Aid. Local government is largely a Band-Aid in keeping people from going through crisis and immediate rapid response until there's federal action. We do not have the resources to distribute reparations. I just told you it's 70 to 80 billion here locally. Our city budget is 1.3 billion, and that's for all the city services that we provide. Even if you collect all of the city budgets and the state budgets across the country, we're talking less than $5 trillion. So city and state governments by themselves could not pay that debt. And we're just talking reparations. If we start talking about other policies that require a monetary commitment, then we're talking about even more money, more trillions and trillions of dollars that only the federal government can actually do because they can print that money. They can raise the debt ceiling. So yes, local government is closer to those issues, closer to those people, and we can make that transformation quicker. But the federal government, they got that Federal Reserve, and that Federal Reserve is going to be able to pay those reparations to the extent that they need to be paid, to the extent that that debt is owed. So local government might be quicker, but you're also not going to have as much of the resources to do as much as you need to do.
So from a local level, it's really, you can say, a matter of time. You're looking at transformation over a period of time. Whereas if you, on a federal level, things could happen a lot quicker. Let's just say if through Congress, certain bills and acts go through. But being in local government over a sustained period of time is how you could make a certain amount of change that you might be looking to make as it pertains to reparative justice. Is that what you're saying? Because you don't have necessarily the funds of the federal government, so therefore over time, you'd have to just keep chipping away and chipping away and chipping away, at a local level, to make a certain level of restorative justice occur in a Black community. Is that what you're saying?
You could think of it that way. I would frame it backwards and say it's quantity versus quality.
Okay.
Example, we passed, the past couple years since I've been on council, we've passed a whole lot of social service money. We even had a guaranteed income program that was done through a national partner for 3 specific neighborhoods that are historically Black neighborhoods, overwhelmingly Black, that are sending out stipends to folks, monthly, younger folks, younger Black folk. They're getting those stipends. Yeah, we can do that program real quick and turn it around, but that's just a quantity thing. I can pass a bunch of ordinances locally. I could pass 100 ordinances and it might not have as much weight, thinking about quality, as Congress enacting a federal reparations program.
Mm.
That one federal reparations program would have more value monetarily than 100 ordinances that I've passed. And I say that thinking about, we filed 109 pieces of legislation. We've passed over 100 at this point. But again, because the budget is so small, because we're talking about local government, we're talking about a few 100,000 people, that's the tax base, it's not going to have the same impact as Congress, which we're talking about trillions and hundreds of millions of people in that tax base. So I think it's quantity versus quality, but you could flip it either way.
Okay. Now, when it comes to running for local office, right? What did you factor in your decision to say, I want to run for city council, versus saying, I want to run for mayor, or I want to run for governor, or even something more grand than that? I want to run for, Congress and be in the House of Representatives, or something of that nature. What did you factor in to say, you know what? Yeah, city council is where it's at for me.
So I would almost liken it to, as a musician, I've played shows and I've, sold tickets. If I can get over 1,000 people to come to this event as a musician, I should be able to get over 1,000 people to vote for me. And I say that thinking about the vote history. I'm in a district that's largely disenfranchised in terms of voter turnout, not only for our district, but also other districts, low income areas, predominantly Black areas. Disenfranchisement is so real. And when you compare the turnout for those primary elections compared to primary elections in other neighborhoods with a higher socioeconomic, it's totally different. We're talking about thousands of people versus 1,000 people. So for me, it was like, this is what I'm looking at locally, being able to pull people out to a concert. I should be able to do the same thing locally here as a city council person. We got in, 1,400 something votes. That's not a lot of people, thinking about Louisville being hundreds of thousands of people. So in this district that happened, I actually think, for me personally, because my work has been spread across the city, I might have had a better chance running for a citywide at-large position versus just a council district, because not all my work has been in Metro Council District 4 that I represent today. I've gone to schools all across the city, community centers, libraries all across the city. So, but I'm a different situation. If your work has been hyper-focused in your neighborhood or in your council district, then you'll probably have a better chance running a race and winning in your neighborhood or in your council district, as opposed to something that's at large. If you're running for mayor, but people across town don't know you and you can't point to expertise of doing work across town, you might not want to run for mayor. But if you do have that experience, then you could potentially get the whole city to turn out and support you. And the same thing goes for like if you want to run for Congress and that district involves majority of your city and you have work across the city, you can make that happen. But if you can't point to work that you've done across that city and notoriety that you have with people in different pockets of that city, it might not make sense to run for Congress or for mayor or for anything at large. You want to focus on where you can actually get people to turn out and support you.
I think one of the key things that might go over some people's heads as well that you stated quickly, within your response, and I would love for you to give a little bit more detail on, is that it appears that you had a presence in your community before you even ran for city council. Is that correct? And if so, can you go into that a little bit?
For sure. So I had a platform that had X, Y, and Z policies on it. And I was able to comfortably point to those policies and say, I've already done something in the capacity of being a community activist or organizer, a teacher, a musician, and give people confidence to know that I'm not just selling you hopes and dreams. I didn't just pop up out of nowhere and say, support me. I think I can do this. I'm showing you that I've already done it to a certain extent. And now, as a council person with that political power, we can do even more. So that's really important for folks to grasp. To run for office, you got to be able to point to a track record. Otherwise, you're selling hopes and dreams, especially if you're running against an incumbent who can point to a track record. You got to be able to point to an alternative. And if you don't have an alternative, if your alternative is just hypothetical, then it's harder to sell that to people. But from news articles that are floating around online, from the work that's been done before council, to even just being able to point to the impact because the people that you're asking to vote for you, it's really important to establish yourself way before then. You can't just pop up and think you can lead folks if you don't have any experience leading. And I've been able to lead, like I said, teaching, not just in the public school system, but those community centers, those libraries, those boys and girls clubs. Me having that experience made me a trustworthy leader in this capacity. But if you don't have that beforehand, you're probably not going to be able to sell it to people after the fact.
What were some of the technical things that you looked into that brought you to the conclusion that I can actually run and win this race?
Ballotpedia is an incredible resource, sample ballots, looking at past elections, looking at people's platforms. But looking at vote count and turnout is important, because when I can point to the number of people who came out in the primary, let's say the past 3 years, and get an average, and let's say that number is about 1,500 to win the race. If you can confidently say, I can get 1,500 people to vote for me. I'm not talking about 1,500 yard signs, because yard signs don't vote. I'm not talking about 1,500 retweets, because retweets don't vote. I'm not talking about 1,500 likes or clicks, or I'm talking about 1,500 votes, which is a commitment, because people got to figure out in between work and school and whatever, other commitments, they got to come out. They got to, have some level of like voter intentionality and education, know who they're voting for, and vote for you. That's a commitment to get somebody to come out of their work, come out of their school, come out of their home, go to the polling place and vote for you. If you can confidently get your vote count to do that, your 50% plus one, that is a technical requirement, But if you can't look at that number, and I'm saying, 1,500 for our district, you might have a larger district that you're looking at. Chicago, those wards are huge. New York City, those wards are huge. You might have to get 10,000 people, 20,000 people. If you can't look at that number and have confidence that you're able to pull those people out, you probably shouldn't run, unless you just want to run to get the experience and get a base for what your vote count is. If I would have ran and had, let's say, 100 votes less than what I needed to win, then I know, okay, I could do this. I just need to do X, Y, and Z more. So when it comes to like technical things to look at, that vote count is really key and really important. A tool that we used outside of, looking at elections in the past with Ballotpedia was Vote Builder. And that's something that's kind of a standard for folks who are running races, because Vote Builder shows you the trends of voters in specific precincts. And that tells you what precinct you need to go to, doors you should knock on, who turned out to vote in the primary in the past however many years, what their race was, what their phone number, email is, what their address is. It has a lot of information for you to be able to go and reach voters. So, those are just a couple technical pieces, but if you want to keep talking about more, we can.
Well, sure. What are the other technical pieces, if there are more? The more the merrier.
So the other two I would say are absolutely important and kind of required for you to actually run a successful race would be your team, and then also some sort of fundraising mechanism. Your team is key because you physically will not be able to reach everyone. It's impossible. For us, we got 30,000 constituents in our district, let's say 15,000-ish households. I wasn't able to knock on 15,000 doors in the course of, half a year, especially because I'm thinking back 2020, COVID hit and folks didn't know what was going on and they didn't know if they could knock on doors. So how do you have a team of people that are able to knock on those doors for you, or in some cases, and if you can't knock on the doors, what else does outreach look like? Because getting 1,500 people to commit to vote is one thing, but reaching thousands of people is a whole other tactic, and you absolutely need a team for that. So can you get people to commit to vote for you, 50% plus one of the electorate? Can you also get a team of people that you need to reach those voters? And then the other technical piece, you want to make sure that you fundraise. I talked about yard signs earlier. I talked about social media earlier. Those don't pay for themselves. Advertising on social media doesn't pay for itself. The materials that you leave behind to give to people, your t-shirts, that has to be paid for in some way. In some cases, you might have partnerships, but keep in mind that politics, when it's an election season, those companies that do that printing, that's their bread and butter. You know what I mean? So that they gotta make that cake. So they're gonna be relying on you to fundraise as much as you can to come in and pay for those goods that you need to get out.
I'm glad you went there with the funding because I wanted to talk to you about that. Um, I was following you from the beginning of your campaign when you first started running, right? And I'll say this, for the most part, online, you didn't have a large social media presence. How do you fundraise? And how did you, I should say, successfully fundraise your campaign to win without a large online presence? Because a lot of people feel that that's what you need to have, and it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, obviously, but in this world where everything is just seems to be online now, many of us are fixated with that. I need a lot of followers, I need a lot of subscribers, but you were able to successfully crowdfund without that. So if you can you detail how you were able to do that? How you were able to successfully crowdfund your campaign without a large social media following?
So I'll share, but I want people to know that my circumstances were special because in 2020, COVID, we also had the uprisings. And that's important for context because before COVID hit, I was fundraising like a musician. It's like we're gonna have an event where I bring together a bunch of musicians and people could pay tickets and come out, and we'll put that money into the campaign. It was like a hustle to get people to support, and it was also like this tangible, proponent to it, where it's like you're not just giving money and it just goes into an invisible pot that eventually turns into something. It's like, hey, when you give us X amount of dollars, that helps pay for a yard sign. When you give us X amount of dollars, that helps us boost something and promote it on social media. When you give us X amount of dollars, it helps us pay a team member. So you understood going into it what you were helping pay for. Now, here's the part that was special for our campaign. When that pandemic hit, we actually stopped fundraising. We stopped asking for money. And that was a conscious decision that I made because people were scared. I don't know if you remember, like early on in the pandemic, folks were like buying up all these things at the grocery store. It was crazy. People
Mm,
were really concerned with what they were going to do. People were, getting put out of work left and right. So I didn't think it made sense to ask people who are struggling, even more than they usually are. Hey, what they say in the campaign emails: chip in, chip in, chip in. Ain't nobody trying to chip in. They're trying to survive right now. So what we turned into really was like this mutual aid effort, where we said, if you want to donate, we're going to use that to pay for masks. If you want to donate, we're going to use that to help people take care of, supplies that they need to stay safe. Forget the campaign. Let's use our platform as people running for office to do mutual aid, which is an important tactic within organizing, just to make sure people are taken care of as they hit the ground. So that was one really important piece that I want to make sure people understand. For us, we stopped fundraising at one point. Fast forward, what helped us raise funding was earned media. Before the uprisings, before George Floyd was killed, before Ahmaud Arbery was killed, before Breonna Taylor was killed, we were talking that talk about what people coin as, equity and racial justice and whatever the buzz phrase is. We were already talking that talk. We were already engaged in reparative justice and the demand for reparations. So when the uprising started, I naturally became a voice of that movement here locally. Was on, CNN, was on BBC, was on all these different national networks talking about Louisville and talking about what we wanted to see change. And it just so happened that I was a candidate. So people are looking me up and say, "Oh, he's a candidate. I'm gonna go donate to that campaign because I just saw you talking on, whatever news channel it was about X, Y, and Z." And there was this sense, I think, of almost like white guilt, where folks just wanted to give to Black candidates. That's a very special circumstance compared to today, where you're competing for dollars with all sorts of other things. But you got to be able to give your campaign value, whether that's saying your $15 pays for a yard sign, or your $5 pays for a magnet, or your whatever pays for this. You got to be able to show people what that value is, and they got to believe in what you're saying. And it's hard to believe in it if you don't have a history and a track record of actually doing it. So the best way to fundraise, if your platform, is 100 as far as people support what you're trying to do, and you can garner their trust based on what you've already done, you're naturally going to be able to raise dollars offline or online.
so it looks like to me, when it comes to running a successful campaign overall, based off of everything that you've said thus far in our dialogue, the largest, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears that the greatest component to winning is already having a relatively solid track record and history of the community that you're already within prior to running, because you need to have something to point to that you can say, hey, I've already done X, Y, and Z, that validates you even running to begin with. Correct? Am I
Yeah,
correct on that?
yeah, and I like to simplify it. Like, there's three M's, and there's so much more than this. So forgive the oversimplification, but there's three M's. You got your money, you got your mobilization, and you have your message. All three of those, your candidate is really running through, and who your candidate is, what they believe in, is really running through all three of those. But I would say they're all equally as important. But if one of those is lacking, then you got to, step it up somewhere else. Or if one of those is like exceeding, you might be able to slack somewhere else. So if you got a bunch of money, you might not have to do so much mobilization, because the mobilization can help supplement not having a bunch of money. If we don't have a bunch of money, then we need more volunteers to go out and knock on doors or call people or text people. If you got a bunch of money, you can put a bunch of billboards up, which we never had the money or the want to even do. But you don't have to have a bunch of people knocking on doors. You can put a bunch of billboards up. You can put some commercials on TV. You can do social media ads. You can get some fake robocalls sent out. But keep in mind that messaging part. If your message is strong, then it's a lot easier to raise money. It's a lot easier to inspire people to join your volunteer team. But I think all three of those, money, mobilization, and your message, are equally as important. But if you're really exceeding in one, then you have, kind of an opportunity to slack somewhere else. But I think you need to be really strong in all of those to run a campaign.
And lastly, moving forward, what do you have planned for yourself? Do you plan on remaining in city council and continue to run for re-election, or do you plan on maybe taking a step forward toward maybe running for mayor? What do you personally have on the horizon for yourself?
So I say this as an elected official. I do not believe that electoral politics, I do not believe that electoral politics by itself is what is going to change America. I think that people have to get involved in community organizing, because electoral politics does not matter if there's not a base, if there's not a community of people using their power to influence that electoral politics. When you look up all the legislation that I've sponsored, again, 109 pieces of legislation, a couple of them are pending because they go to committees this week. Most of them passed, two of them have failed, only two. And I'm talking about legislation, historic hundreds of millions of dollars into affordable housing, all this money into violence prevention programs. We got our community center renovated. We got a library renovated. We're about to reopen a library in a Black community that closed a few years before I was born in 92. I'm talking about legislation we've been able to pass to really make some changes in this city. But none of that has passed without community being involved in some capacity. And the two pieces of legislation that failed, one was banning discrimination based on your credit score when you're trying to get a job. And one was making sure that the funding that our council offices get was split up equitably and not equally, because a council district that's impoverished should not get the same amount of funding as a council district that's really wealthy. And I think you would agree with that. Trying to change that failed as well. Those failed not because they were bad policies. They failed because we didn't have the votes. And we didn't have the votes because we didn't have the people power behind it. Everything else has some people power, whether it was people showing up to speak in support of it, whether it was people submitting letters of support from their institution or their grassroots movement, or there was something I can point to where the community was engaged and said, this is what we want. This is what we need. People power, community organizing is what changes things. Slavery wasn't abolished because a bunch of white politicians decided to abolish slavery. It happened because there was a movement, an abolitionist movement. Segregation wasn't abolished because a bunch of politicians decided to abolish it. A people movement happened. Ella Baker and Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy, all these people formed a movement to put power behind it. So electoral politics is only as important as the people power that is behind the people who are elected into office. So to answer your question, am I running again? If I had to answer your question right now, absolutely not. Because we're dealing with centuries deep issues that some of our people think you can fix overnight. My term is 4 years. You can't fix 400 years within 4 years. And a lot of people don't see the value of their power in politics. And it gets complicated and confusing, and people don't think it's for them, and they say, I don't do politics. Nina Turner, love her or hate her, said it best. You might not do politics, but politics will do you. We need people power to be engaged in everything we do. And again, when you look at that legislation that we've been able to pass, it took organizing people to pass it, because you organize the masses and then those 14 votes are nothing. But when I'm in that council chamber in City Hall and I'm introducing something, all other members got to say is, I can't do this because my constituents don't support it. But when you have people power, and not just me like physically going to get people together, but if I got 100 people in my district who got 10 cousins over here and a high school friend over there and a nephew over there, all they got to do is hit them up and say, hey, we support this. Will you talk to your council member to support it too? And it creates this wave of power. But if you don't have that human power, electoral politics means nothing, because then politicians just get bought up by companies. They get bought up by donors. They get bought up by whoever and everybody. What's the alternative to that? Do you know your city council member? Do you know your state representative, your state senator? And how are you engaged in the work that they do? Because if you're not engaged in that fight, if you're not engaged in it, we can't have change. There can be no change without people power. I get off my tangent. What's next for me is like continuing community organizing. I proudly organize with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation. I don't want to be in electoral politics forever. I want to get back to being able to mobilize people and being able to empower people to get involved in politics, not be a politician. I think to a certain extent, like we forget after the people are in office, well, now they got a job to do, and that
Mhm.
job needs to be reinforced by that people power. And I think it might have been either King or maybe it was Carter G. Woodson, the miseducation of the Negro, that talked about slowly that the black politician becomes kind of like untangled with his people because people get frustrated and they get impatient and then that's their enemy all of a sudden. But if that black politician is the enemy of the black people, well, if the people don't respect him when he's trying to introduce a bill, what makes you think that the white colleagues or whatever race is going to respect him when his own base of constituents don't respect him? So that people power is so key, and it has to be in lockstep with whoever that person is that's representing that people, or you ain't gonna accomplish nothing.
So you'd say that with the good that comes with being in local politics, the focus really should be more so on getting people power in order. So that's where you're looking to shift your focus after your term is up, is getting back to the grassroots and developing what you call people power within the community to force your politicians to do what it is that you want them to do. Am I correct in that?
Hell yeah. And I say force like I'm of the king philosophy that we aren't intimidating people or humiliating people. We're articulating problems so well that you cannot ignore them. Whether that's, those marches that were broadcast on TV for the world to see, or direct action that results in somebody seeing it in a different way and saying, you know what, we got to do something about that. Well, here's the solution. Here's the bill. Here's the ordinance. Here's the act. But yeah, getting that people power together is so important. And you got to realize electoral politics, this is another reason why like my job sucks, is it's not about what's right. It's about what's popular. But thinking about that Kingonian philosophy again, I would rather have conviction than consensus. So a lot of times we chase consensus. Who got the most votes? Did your bill get the most votes? But is it right? Is it just? Is it moral? Because if we don't have conviction, we'll just do anything and everything and just go along with whatever. And we got to be able to stand on that, having some sort of conviction about what's right versus just something that's popular. And I say that thinking about the fact that people, individuals will call our office or engage their local city council person for an individual need. All right. And my job is to pass policy. So if you contact our office for an individual need and we direct you to the office or the department that you're supposed to go to, and that bothers you, you're upset on the front end because you didn't know who to call. And when we tried to tell you who to call, now you mad. And now that's another person who's like, I'm not going to support them because they told me who to call to address the fact that leaves fell on my car. I can't make this up. To address the fact that leaves fell on my car. Never mind that you got this community center funded. Never mind you got this library reopened. Never mind you got all this housing money. You know what I mean? Never mind any of that. Because you're unpopular to me because you didn't address my individual problem, now I got a problem with you and now I'm not going to support you. Politics is unfortunately this popularity contest. And I'm not with that. And I can't wait to be out of it. But when you bring that people power together, that's when people realize, oh, my issue of the leaves falling on my car is not as important as the fact that over half of the families living outside are black. How can we wrap our arms around that problem instead of my individual need that needs to go there? So that's why people power is really key, because you can really align people priorities as well.
Now, I want to thank you for joining me today, Jecorey. I appreciate you taking this time out to discuss, how to run a campaign effectively to win, but also giving us that extra insight on the importance of people power and how people power can be, or if not actually equally as important as being an individual who's in office. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for providing us with this information and for engaging with me in a fruitful dialogue. I appreciate you joining me today, brother.
I appreciate you. Never forget, the power of the people is stronger than the people in power.
Absolutely.